friends, colleagues, and everyone who believes that public power deserves public answers. Thank you for being here as we take up a moment that too often dissolves into sound bites. White House Press Secretary vs. Reporter. Border policy under fire. In the daily briefing room, where fluorescent lights glare and cameras blink like impatient metronomes, the exchange between a spokesperson and a journalist can feel like a gladiator match, all parry and thrust, winner and loser. But if we strip away the spectacle and listen for substance, we discover something else, something the country needs more than viral clips, a civic instrument tuned to the key of verification. Because border policy is not a slogan, it is a system, it is statutes and staffing charts, it is asylum interviews under Title VIII authority, not the expired pandemic-era Title 42 expulsions. It is reception capacity at ports of entry, the technology that scans license plates and fingerprints, the overtime budgets of border patrol sectors from San Diego to the Rio Grande Valley. It is the hard math of encounters, processing times, detention space, and above all, decisions made quickly and lawfully so that the right people enter through the front door and the wrong people do not slip through the side gate. When a reporter presses a press secretary, what are the metrics that prove the policy is working? We should not hear provocation. We should hear the country asking, show us the receipts. Give us daily averages of encounters. Give us median processing times at ports of entry. Give us how many asylum claims received credible fear determinations within statutory timelines. Give us staffing additions, attrition rates, training hours, and the percent of agents pulled off line work to handle transport and care. Give us the operational effect of bilateral agreements with Mexico and Northern Triangle countries, the throughput created by modernized asylum processing, the number of smugglers interdicted and prosecuted, the total bed space in non-citizen detention, and the share of migrants placed in alternatives to detention with appearance rates at their hearings. These are not footnotes for policy wonks. They are the hinges on which our border operations swing, and so the first principle of any press briefing under fire should be clarity over combat. A press secretary's job is not to dazzle, but to document. A reporter's job is not to perform, but to probe until the documentation is precise enough that citizens can check it for themselves. The stakes are not abstract. Border communities need predictability. Sheriffs want to know how surges will be handled without overwhelming local services. Mayors want to coordinate with federal shelters so parks are not turned into de facto reception centers without sanitation and support. Business owners want a legal migration system that meets labor needs without rewarding criminal networks, and families, on both sides of the border, want a process that is humane, lawful, and comprehensible. At the same time, agents need relief from burnout and a policy framework that reduces catch and release. Incentives while complying with domestic and international law. This cannot be litigated solely in talking points. It must be illuminated in plans. Increased asylum officer hiring so credible fear screenings happen in days, not months. Smart expansion of in-country refugee processing and regional mobility. Pathways so people don't bet their lives to cartels. Stronger consequences under Title VIII for unlawful entry after a removal order, coupled with clear access at ports of entry for those seeking protection, data sharing compacts that identify repeat crossers and smugglers, and resources to local NGO and municipalities so that when an influx does occur, dignity does not collapse into disorder. The briefing podium then becomes a map stand. When the reporter asks, "Where are the choke points?" the answer should point to concrete nodes, insufficient transportation contracting in El Paso leading to backlogs, outdated facilities in Tucson's sector forcing line agents into processing roles, asylum backlogs in immigration courts that blow past the promise of swift, fair adjudication, or strains in the shelter network that shuffle families hundreds of miles without coordination. Each node should be paired with a fix funded, scheduled, auditable. And because border dynamics are adaptive, the metrics must be time, stamped and disaggregated. What was true in April may not be true in November. What's true in the Del Rio sector may diverge from Yuma. The public deserves that granularity because it is the only antidote to cynicism. Without it, we live in a world of dueling adjectives: chaos vs. control, open vs. secure. With it, we live in a world of measurable change. Encounters decreased 18% month in high pressure sectors after Policy X. Asylum interview capacity rose 25% after staffing surge Y. Average custody time fell below 48 hours due to Process Z. Court show-up rates in Pilot City exceeded 90% after Transportation Coordination B. The point is not to massage numbers. The point is to invite checking, show your work, publish the dashboards, tie them to statutory authorities so that when a policy shifts from public health expulsions to immigration law, processing citizens can see the new rules of the road and the consequences for breaking them. Insist, too, on separating the moral from the mechanical. A humane system without operational capacity is a promise that collapses at the first bus drop, while a high-capacity system without humane guardrails corrodes the rule of law it claims to defend. We need both, and we should demand answers that show both. That is why Press Secretary vs. Reporter should not be staged as combatants but as co-producers of public clarity, one accountable for accurate, timely information, the other accountable for asking questions that get beyond spin to substance. Their shared mandate is ours, to know as citizens what is being done in our name and with our dollars at the nation's edge, and whether it is working. What then do answers under fire actually look like? Answers that would satisfy a fair-minded reporter while equipping the country to judge border policy by outcomes rather than optics. They start with baselines. Before we can talk about improvement or deterioration, we must define the normal, against which any surge or lull is measured. That means historical monthly encounter averages disaggregated by sector, nationality, and family composition. It means the processing mix: how many arrived at ports of entry with appointments, how many crossed unlawfully between ports, how many were repeat crossers flagged by biometrics, how many claimed fear and entered the asylum pipeline. It means the disposition mix: how many were removed under expedited removal, how many placed into removal proceedings, how many paroled into the country with reporting obligations, and how many transferred to alternatives, to detention with GPS or check-in requirements. Put these baselines on a public dashboard and pin today's numbers against them. Then move to capacity. How many asylum officers are currently on the line, how many in training, and how many billets are unfunded? What is the daily maximum throughput for credible fear interviews? And what is the target within 90 days? How many immigration judges and courtrooms are operational? And what is the median days? The final hearing in the 5 busiest dockets. How many CBP processing facilities meet standards for family units, and where are the shortfalls in medical screening, language services, and child appropriate space? How many buses, flights, and bed spaces does DHS control directly? And how many rely on ad hoc contracts that fray during spikes? Now, consequences. Under Title 8, unlawful entry after prior removal can trigger 5 or 10-year bars and potential prosecution. How often are those bars applied, and what % of repeat crossers are referred for prosecution? What is the rate of removal for those who do not establish protection claims, and within what time frame? Conversely, for those who do establish a credible fear, How quickly are they moved to merits adjudication, and what share obtain relief? If relief rates differ dramatically by nationality or sector, why? Documentation challenges, country conditions, legal representation rates. Precision matters because smugglers sell narratives, and the only antidote to a cartel's lie is a government's statistically literate truth. Next, offload the burden that does not belong on the line agent's shoulders. Line agents should patrol, interdict, and respond to immediate humanitarian needs, not become default case managers and travel coordinators. That means embedding process teams and surge caseworkers who handle transport, placements, and court paperwork so agents can return to the field. It means contractual redundancies so a single broken bus deal does not turn a station into an improvised shelter. It means data integration so when a person is released with a notice to appear, the receiving city already has an itinerary, a verified address, and a communications plan in a language they understand. It means grants that flow to border towns and destination cities with preset triggers, unlocking funds when arrivals exceed a predictable threshold. In briefings, a press secretary should not merely assert that these mechanisms exist, they should name them. We executed Contract Delta for 2000 additional transport seats. The Tucson sector's caseworker surge team expanded by 120 personnel. The El Paso Collaborative Shelter Table now includes standardized data, pairing with weekly public reports. I see added courtroom capacity in Harlingen with 4 additional dockets, and our 90-day goal is to bring credible fear interview wait times below 10 days in the 3 busiest corridors. Reporters should then ask the surgical follow-up, what's the denominator? If the transport seats rose by 2,000, what % of weekly need does that cover at projected encounter levels? If target is 10-day interviews, what is it now, and how many officers must be on shift to hit it? The aim is to turn words into calculators the public can carry. Finally, square the humanitarian with the deterrent. A system that is all welcome and no consequence invites more journeys than it can safely process. A system that is all consequence and no protection betrays asylum law and moral commitments. The operational sweet spot is clarity, a widely signaled, reliably enforced message that protection is available through lawful channels, regional processing centers, port of entry appointments, in-country programs, and that unlawful crossings will predictably result in swift removal unless protection is established. That clarity is not achieved through adjectives. It is achieved through repetition of outcomes. So in the briefing room, say the quiet part aloud. If you come unlawfully without a protection claim, you will be removed quickly. If you seek protection, here is where and how, and here is how fast we will decide. If you are a smuggler, you will be prosecuted, and here are the indictments this month. Publish the court appearance rates for those in alternatives to detention. Publish the removal rates for those who fail to establish claims. Publish the relief rates for those who do, and the average timeline to safety. Tie each to investments, more asylum officers to accelerate truth, finding more judges to cut the backlog that invites abuse and erodes faith, more shelter coordination to preserve human dignity, more technology to spot repeat crossers and smugglers, more bilateral work so returns are real and humane. When reporters challenge inconsistencies, last month you touted a decline. This month numbers rose. Resist defensiveness and give the pattern. Seasonality, policy adaptation, cartel behavior. Third, country flows, invite the nation to watch with you. Give dates, numbers, and the next checkpoint for judgment. That is what answers under fire. Look like, not spin. Proof but checkable, not perfect but honest. Not a fight for the evening's scoreboard. but a contribution to the country's store of usable facts about one of the most difficult, most argued over responsibilities any democracy can shoulder: the just, secure, and humane management of its borders. If the daily briefing room is the country's most watched seminar on how power should answer to the public, then the wider media ecosystem is the unruly hallway outside the classroom, crowded, loud, and bristling with competing narratives that can either clarify or distort the lesson. White House Press Secretary vs. Reporter, border policy under fire. Doesn't land in a vacuum. It lands in a feed where clips are cropped, captions are editorialized, and a 30-second volley can be framed as triumph or train wreck before the full exchange has even concluded. That is precisely why the craft of answering under pressure must be designed for survivability in the wild. What does that mean? It means building answers that retain meaning when stripped of tone and context, answers that still orient a viewer, even if the preamble and follow-ups are left on the cutting room floor. Think of it like engineering for stress, a bridge that flexes with wind, a hull that sheds waves. The components of such answers are structural numbers with denominators, time, stamped comparisons, week over week, quarter over quarter, explicit legal authorities Title 8, TV Pro, Flores, operational verbs deployed, processed, removed, referred for prosecution, and named programs whose performance is publicly auditable: CBP, 1 appointment throughput, asylum officer surge cohorts, immigration, court docket expansions. When a reporter asks, "Are crossings down?" the press secretary who replies with "Crossings are down 18% month over month in Yuma and 11% in Del Rio, while Tucson rose 7% due to cartel rerouting. Credible fear interview capacity increased 22% across the pilot corridors, cutting median custody from 57 hours to 44. Expedited removals as a share of dispositions rose from 31% to 43% under Title 8 since June 1, has built a sentence complex enough to resist mutilation and precise enough to withstand fact checking. This is not pedantry. It is inoculation against a discourse market that rewards spectacle. And it's not only the administration that benefits. Good questioning that insists on denominators and dates makes journalists more trustworthy to viewers who are exhausted by based combat. Ask out of how many, compared to when, under which authority, with which trade, off. These are the spines of reality. The next consideration is anticipatory rebuttal. Smugglers sell stories as aggressively as any political campaign. They edit the American conversation for their own purposes, pushing narratives like "bring a child and you will be released," or "courts are so backlogged you have years before consequences." Answers under pressure must preempt those myths with declarative, repeatedly broadcast realities. Arriving unlawfully without a protection claim leads to swift removal. Arriving at ports with appointments results in orderly processing. Arriving with a child does not change the legal threshold for protection nor shield against removal if claims do not meet the law. Reentry after removal triggers bars and potential prosecution. These are not slogans, they are operational messages that alter decision calculus. Broadcast them relentlessly in Spanish, Haitian, Creole, Portuguese, and indigenous languages through government channels and trusted partners, then report their performance. Since weekly radio spots began in Guatemala's western highlands clarifying the consequences of unlawful entry, returns of repeat crossers from that region have fallen X%, and port of entry appointments have risen Y%. Precision is the antidote to rumor. Equally important is the humility to distinguish between what is genuinely knowable and what is contingent. Border flows are shaped by forces beyond any administration's immediate control. Gang violence, crop failure, hurricanes, macroeconomic swings, policy shifts in transit countries. When reporters press, "You promised declines, numbers rose," the honest, confidence-building move is to surface the model. Our base case projected a seasonal uptick amplified by cartel adaptation. Last month's enforcement posture, we adjusted by surging asylum officers to drain processing backlogs faster than inflows and by negotiating additional repatriation flights for non-eligible nationalities. Judge our approach on the next 8-week series, not a single week. That's not evasion, it's an invitation to evaluate policy on an appropriate temporal scale. Alongside humility lives audacity, the willingness to say, "We were wrong on X. Here is the fix, and here is when you can verify the improvement." Such admissions are rare because political culture punishes candor, but consider the alternative, a permanent gotcha. Equilibrium that trains spokespersons to dodge and reporters to pounce, leaving the public with theater. Audacity resets incentives by making the fastest path out of a narrative jam the production of better evidence. The ecosystem also includes local voices, sheriffs, shelter directors, city managers, public health leads whose lived data can confirm or challenge official claims. A briefing built for truth invites those voices into the record. Mayor Alvarado reports that emergency room strain in his county fell sharply once DHS embedded medical triage at intake. Here are the wait time stats from his hospital network. When official and local data sets converge, trust rises. When they diverge, the gap becomes a to-do list. The final ingredient is empathy that doesn't curdle into sentimentality. The border is as human as it is statutory. Families fleeing extortion, agents missing birthdays due to overtime, ranchers fixing cut fences, bus drivers doing triage with limited bathrooms, and water caseworkers juggling languages and legalese, city officials mapping shelters against school pickup hours. Answers under pressure that acknowledge that texture. Here's how we protected line agents from burnout. Here's how we ensured families aren't stranded in city parks. Here's how we prevented shelters from collapsing under a 48-hour spike. Create space for seriousness. Empathy without mechanics is a lullaby. Mechanics without empathy is a ledger. The country requires both, braided together, repeated clearly. If we can do that, if our podium sentences are built to survive the algorithmic blender, if our questions are sharpened to demand testable claims, if our narratives preempt smugglers' lies and admit our own misses, and if our data is cross-checked with the people who live at the edge of policy, then the hallway outside the classroom becomes less chaotic. The clips still fly, but they carry ballast. The captions still shout, but they point to dashboards. The argument still rages, but it is about things we can measure and mend. That is how a spectacle begins to behave like a service. Let's descend from rhetoric to the machinery, the gears, belts, and circuit breakers that actually move border policy from intent to outcome. Governance at the border is a relay race across agencies and jurisdictions, and the baton drops when any runner stumbles. The press secretary who faces a barrage should be prepared to map that relay in plain words, because what sounds like they botched it is often a single snapped link. A transport vendor missed pickups, a detention facility fell below medical staffing, an asylum officer cohort graduated 2 weeks late, a repatriation agreement lagged because another sovereign state had a holiday closure, a court docket ran out of bilingual interpreters. Owning the chain is the first step to fixing it. Begin with intake. CBP handles interdiction and initial processing under Title VIII, including biometrics, medical screening, and preliminary categorization, families, single adults, unaccompanied children. Expedited removal is a legal pathway, not a slogan, that allows swift adjudication when protection claims are not asserted or do not meet the threshold. Credible fear. Interviews kick claimants into an asylum pipeline run by USCIS asylum officers, with immigration judges, DOJ ERR, conducting merits hearings downstream. ICE manages detention, alternatives to detention, and removals. HHS handles unaccompanied children. State negotiates repatriation and regional pathways. Local governments and NGO absorb the human flow, shelter, transport, basic services under the pressure of time and limited budgets. The entire system sits under a canopy of court decisions. Floor is settlement on minors, TV, PRA on unaccompanied children, circuit, level precedents on detention and release standards, and constrained by appropriations lines carved up in omnibus bills or continuing resolutions. When the reporter asks, "Why didn't you prevent street releases?" the operational answer may be because IC contracted bed space hit the ceiling, DHS transport failed to materialize at the promised cadence, shelter partners were at occupancy, and Title VIII processing could not legally hold people beyond standards. We triggered contingency X, but its activation threshold was set. Here's the fix. Additional pop-up capacity negotiated in advance. Transport contracts with redundancy ABC vendors, and a revised surge protocol that embeds caseworkers at stations. The public doesn't need every acronym. They need a coherent map that explains cause and remedy. Funding mechanics are next. Agencies run on appropriations with specific colors of money. It's not enough to say we need more resources. Answers should specify O and M for transport, FD for asylum officers, capital for family, appropriate processing spaces, grants to localities under a transparent formula, keyed to arrivals per capita. When a reporter presses, "Why didn't you anticipate the spike?" say, "We did, but money appropriated to line item A can't be moved to B without reprogramming authority. We requested it on date D. Congressional approval arrived on date E. In the gap, we use contingency funds F and volunteer details to hold the line. Our ask now. Baseline authority, so a predictable surge fund triggers automatically." This translation of appropriations arcana into citizen language is not optional. It is the only way to turn critique into repair. Law is the other cage, and the other guardrail. Title 42 expulsions a public health authority used during the pandemic ended. Now Title 8 governs. That means consequences for unlawful reentry are higher, but processing is more complex. Flores limits detention of minors. TV sets special procedures for unaccompanied children. Some court decisions constrain family detention, timelines, and conditions. When a spokesperson speaks plainly about these frames without fear that clarity will be weaponized, they create a discourse where debate is about levers we actually possess rather than fantasy levers we do not. For instance, we cannot lawfully detain families for months pending hearings. Therefore, our deterrence must rely on rapid adjudication and swift removal for those without claims, balanced by lawful access at ports for those seeking protection. That requires more asylum officers and judges, not just more beds. Now consider bilateral diplomacy. Returns require destination countries to accept flights. Safe and humane returns require coordination. Regional processing requires partners to open intake, and vetting, shared enforcement against smuggling requires intelligence cooperation. When numbers spike among a particular nationality, diplomacy often becomes the limiting reagent. A credible answer under pressure will say so in time. Stamp progress. We secured acceptance of X weekly flights. Country Y began document issuance for returnees. Joint Task Force Z arrested and smugglers. Ports A and B added appointment capacity. That specificity also arms the press to check with foreign ministries and independent monitors. Finally, the municipal layer, the mayors and county judges who live the frontline reality, they need predictable money, predictable data, predictable escalation ladders. A smart system sets triggers tied to arrivals so that grants auto release without a week of paperwork in the middle of a surge, and it enshrines weekly coordination calls where federal leads show their dashboards and take heat. In briefings, point to that cadence every Wednesday 3 p.m. We meet with city leads from Brownsville to San Diego. Here are the 3 red flags from last week and the fixes due by Friday. That single sentence does more for public trust than a dozen glossy talking points. Because what citizens want to know beneath the politics is who's on the hook, by when, with what yardstick. The more the administration can replace abstractions with that triad, and the more journalists insist upon it, the more resilient our border governance becomes. Mistakes will still happen, spikes will still arrive, but failure will be quarantined to specific parts and repaired with specific tools, instead of metastasizing into a mood of helplessness. And that, in the end, is the difference between a system and a spectacle. Systems learn. So where does this leave us, citizens, officials, journalists, after the lights cool and the headline scrolls past? It leaves us with a blueprint, not for perfection, which is for statues, but for progress, which is for people who have to work tomorrow. The blueprint has a dull, beautiful word at its center: repeatability. Answers under pressure should be so plainly structured that any informed citizen could run the same steps next month and come to largely the same evaluation. Begin with the 4 C's: context, capacity, consequences, coordination. Context, the baselines and seasonality against which we judge change. Capacity, the people, spaces, contracts, and courtrooms that determine throughput. Consequences, the lawful outcomes for different pathways, lawful entries, protection claims, unlawful entries. Coordination, the handoffs federal to city, CBP to USCIS to ERR to ICE, U.S. to partner nations. Build every briefing response along that spine. Publish dashboards keyed to each C and pin them to dates. The next layer is promises we can audit. A healthy administration should speak in sentences that make citizens reach for calendars, not adjectives. By January 15, credible fear interview wait times in the 3 busiest corridors will be under 10 days. By February 28, removal processing for non-eligible single adults will average under 72 hours unless constrained by flight availability. By March 31, we will publish city-level grant disbursements with triggers and receipts every Wednesday at 3 p.m. We will hold open coordination calls with municipal leads and post readouts within 24 hours. Journalists should code their questions to these promises and revisit them on schedule. It's January 16. Did you hit the 10-day benchmark? If not, which bottleneck? What's the ETA? Citizens can play too, by treating government like a subscription they pay for because they do. Favorite the dashboards, share the readouts, and resist clips that don't name denominators or dates. On the deterrence, humanity axis, the blueprint demands symmetry. Expand lawful pathways that are orderly and safe regional processing. Family reunification channels, worker visas where appropriate, and make unlawful pathways predictably unattractive, swift, lawful removals, prosecution for smugglers and repeat crossers. Pair each with measures that dignify people and protect communities. Medical triage at intake, transportation that prevents sidewalk encampments, language access communications that explain rights and obligations, and support for receiving cities tied to arrivals per capita. Then harden the learning loop. Every surge should end with a published after-action report that identifies what failed, what worked, and what will change before the next wave. Name the contracts that lagged, the facilities that buckled, the dockets that jammed. Celebrate the fixes. Vendor Bravo met surge pickups 98% on time. The Harlingen courtroom expansion processed 27% more cases. The Tucson surge caseworker team cut agent off line hours by 19. Invite outside auditors, GAO, inspectors general, academic partnerships to evaluate claims. Transparency breeds durability. Will any of this charm the algorithm? Sometimes, but that's not the point. The point is to build a civic metabolism strong enough to digest crises without emotional malnutrition. In that metabolism, the press secretary is not a gladiator but a guide. The reporter is not a heckler but a cartographer. And the public is not a passive audience but an editor with receipts. We need a culture that treats "I don't know, I'll check and post the data by 6 p.m." as competence, not weakness, that treats "we missed the target, here's the bottleneck, here's the fix by Friday" as integrity, not ammunition. We need political actors who stop aiming for the clip and start aiming for the ledger, and newsrooms that reward follow-through as much as fireworks. And we, the rest of us, must practice a citizen's discipline, amplify specifics, quarantine spin, and vote, yes, vote, for people who talk in plans. The border will remain hard. Human desperation, criminal opportunism, and the friction of law will not vanish. But hard is not hopeless. Hard is an engineer's word, a journalist's beat, a public's apprenticeship. If we make habit out of the practices in this blueprint, metrics with denominators, timelines with dates, authorities with citations, actions with fixes, then the phrase "under fire" will gradually mean something different in our politics. It will mean under the heat of verification, and not under the glare of theater. And that shift, quiet and unglamorous as it is, would be a victory worth far more than any viral headline. A democracy that, when pressed, answers not with panic or posture, but with proof.